Hey, it's Ryan here today with some tips and advice for fishing one of my favorite ice out fisheries, and that is Big Stone Lake.
Yeah, fish.
Take a look at that pig.
Okay, let's get him.
In all reality, I'm partial to Big Stone year-round just because that's where I grew up and I've always loved that lake. There's a lot of diversity out there now. There's a lot of different fishing opportunities. Big Stone really gained a reputation as a walleye factory in the 90s and early 2000s, but in recent years, it's really made a switch. It's gone from a walleye-dominated fishery to more of a perch, panfish, and bass fishery. One of the unique things about Big Stone Lake is the ability to start fishing right away when the ice goes off. There is no closed season on Big Stone. So unlike the rest of Minnesota where you have to wait until fishing opener, which is mid-May, as soon as the ice goes off on Big Stone, we get on the water and we start chasing bass. Now, Big Stone has a couple things going for it. Not only the ability to fish out there year-round for game fish, but Big Stone has also gained a reputation not only for producing numbers of bass, but it really has some incredible trophy potential. In recent years, Big Stone has hosted a variety of different bass tournaments, and one of which a couple years ago took almost 32 pounds to win, which in Minnesota is almost unheard of. So Big Stone produces numbers of bass, and Big Stone produces very big fish. Big Stone, to give you a little background on it, is a large, fertile body of water. It's about the 12th largest lake in Minnesota, about 12,500 acres, 26 miles long, roughly a mile wide, has about 72 miles of shoreline. Big Stone is a big, big fishery, but there's ways of breaking it down. And that's what I'm gonna go through today is how I break down Big Stone Lake during the ice out period. So we're gonna get pretty specific here. I'm not gonna talk about all the way throughout the summer and into the fall. I'm going to talk about the ice out period, specifically when water temps are in that 40-degree range. When I think of spring fishing bass on Big Stone, in my mind, I break it down into two seasons during the spring. One is going to be ice out, and that's when water temps are in the 40s, maybe creeping into the lower 50s. The second of which is going to be pre-spawn, when water temps are in the 50s, just starting to creep into the lower 60s. The spawn on Big Stone Lake takes place right around Memorial Day weekend. Ice out on Big Stone Lake typically takes place sometime around early to mid-April. So as with any body of water, it's always important to have an understanding of the big picture. And I'm going to break that down for you, how I break down Big Stone Lake. But before I start breaking down the actual layout of the lake, I think it's important for everybody to realize how big of a factor weather plays in fishing in the spring. Most fishermen understand this, they know it, they realize it, it's obvious. But for those of you who may not know it or may not understand the importance of it, specifically on Big Stone Lake, I'm going to go through that real quick. Number one is Big Stone Lake is a prairie lake. It is windy out there most of the time. I'd say out of 3 days, 2 of them are going to be windy on Big Stone. So it's important to understand which way the wind is blowing. A lot of times you're going to find that a north wind is going to be a cool wind, and that's typically associated with cold fronts. A south wind is going to be a warm wind that's more associated with a warming trend. Warming trends in the spring tend to push fish up shallow. Cold fronts in the spring tend to push fish a little bit deeper. And wind is definitely going to have a play because wind can push warmer water into smaller pockets, especially in bays in the spring. It can really isolate fish into small areas. So a warm south wind creates some really incredible opportunities. But a big heavy wind can make fishing difficult. Big Stone largely runs north to south. We'll say northwest to southeast. So with prevailing northwest winds in that area and a lot of south winds, you're going to notice that a lot of times you need to kind of duck the wind, especially when you start talking winds that are in 20 to 30 mile an hour range. Now, there's ways of doing that. You can look at a map. One of my favorite sources for finding wind is going to be windfinder.com. I go to their app. Not only do I use the location and see which way the wind is pointing, but another thing I do is I use their map. Their map is really important because you can scroll through the wind on each particular day from like a 3-hour period to a 3-hour period, and you can see how the wind vectors across the map of the lake, and it'll give you a much better understanding of how the wind is pushing into certain areas and how certain areas are going to be protected from the wind, not only for the fish to be using them, but also for you to be able to get out there and fish effectively. Another thing about the wind is Big Stone doesn't have big isolated bays or coves like you may be used to on certain lakes. You're not going to find protected harbors for launching your boat. So this is going to tie into the layout of the lake. There's two accesses on Big Stone that I really like. And the first of which is going to be the foot of the lake in Ortonville, Minnesota. That's right downtown, tons of parking, good ramps down there. That is going to be best on any light winds or a heavy south wind. It's protected from a south wind down there. My second favorite landing is going to be on the Minnesota side. It's another free one. You don't have to pay to use it. That's going to be the Mallard Point access, and that's at the midpoint of Big Stone Lake. It's got good parking there, good ramps there, and that's going to be a good ramp to use when winds are light or if you have a strong north wind. It's fairly protected from a north wind there. So those are kind of not only good accesses to use, but they're also good as far as relating to where the fish are in the lake. I consider these accesses kind of like bookends on Big Stone Lake. Now, Mallard Point is almost dead center of the lake, and anything north of that, you're going to find that the layout of Big Stone is quite a bit different than it is on the south end. It's a little bit dirtier water to the north. It's void of any real structure up there, and it tends to be more of walleye habitat. Whether it's perch, panfish, or bass, you're going to find the vast majority of those to the south of Mallard Point. So for bass fishermen, Mallard Point is kind of the northern end, the upstream end of the bookends when it comes to where most of the bass, I'd say 90% of the bass relate. Mallard Point and south is where you're going to find all of that. On the contrary, the south end of the lake, the other end of the bookend, that's the bottom end of the lake. So between Mallard Point and the south end, that southern half of the lake, that's where you're going to find most of the fish on Big Stone. Now, there's three main sections that I consider the way I see it when I look at Big Stone. One is going to be the north section, and that's from Mallard Point north. It typically is going to be shallower, dirtier water with much less structure up there. Like I said, that's mostly walleye territory, especially the further north you go. The middle section is kind of that section that runs almost east to west. That's going to be the deepest section of the lake. There's considerably more structure there, but it's also going to be the clearest water typically that you're going to find in the lake. There's much more in the way of perch and panfish and bass in the central section than there is in the northern section. The southern section of the lake is where it starts to kind of run north and south again. And that goes from that corner there down to Ortonville. And that is going to have the most structure by far. Water clarity is still pretty good down there. It may not be quite as clear as the central section, but it's still pretty clear. The central, a lot of times you're going to find 5-6 foot water clarity. The south section, you might find that it's, somewhere in that 4 foot range, maybe 3 foot range. It seems like on Big Stone Lake, to a certain extent, the farther south you go, the more bass you run into. Now, as I see Big Stone, in my mind, there are four main structures out there that run the length of the lake, and they're basically related to depth. The first of which is going to be the shoreline, and that is just the bank to 2 feet of water. And that becomes good, especially when water temperatures warm up and become more consistent. Right away at ice out, a lot of times it's too inconsistent. You don't find very many fish right up tight to the bank. The second of which will be the shallow structures. And the shallow structures are what I consider anything in that 3 to 6 foot of water range. You may find mud flats, rock piles, maybe some sand and gravel, but those are going to be your shallow structures. The third structure is going to be the main break, and the main break is about 7 to 11 feet of water. Now, you may find different types of cover on the main break. Sometimes it'll just be a tapering mud flat. Sometimes it'll be sand or gravel. But the one that becomes a real player during the ice out period is the main break, where it drops off sharply and it has good rock on it. Those are some of my favorite spots during the ice out period, especially when you're dealing with cooler water, like a cold front or an early morning, or just early on during the ice out period. That main break with rock on it where it drops off sharply becomes very important. Lastly is the basin, and that's largely where a lot of things get started at ice out. And the basin on Big Stone is only about 12 to 14 foot in most places. Big Stone tops out at about 16 feet of water. But for the most part, the basin is about 12 to 14 feet deep, and a lot of bass may be using the basin during the winter. But as the ice goes off the lake, those fish will push towards that main break. They start to congregate where the main break is sharp and covered in large rock. And those become really your first spots where you want to focus your attention, especially when water temps are in the low 40s. There's 3 times where I use the main break almost exclusively. Number 1 is right after ice out. Number 2 is when you're dealing with a cold front, when things have dropped off sharply. Those fish aren't going to stay up shallow. They're going to come back and they're going to stick to that main break. The third is going to be mornings, because a lot of times the fish are following water temperature. So they may go up and use those shallow flats that are really close to that main break. They may use those during the day, but as soon as things cool down and you get a cold night where it drops into the low 30s or even the 20s, a lot of times those fish are going to pull back and they're going to get tight to that main break again. So that main break is very critical during the ice out period when water temps are in the 40s. There's 2 main techniques that I use during the ice out period. Number 1 is going to be jerk baits. Number 2 is going to be crankbaits. When I'm fishing the main break, I use jerk baits almost exclusively. I will occasionally use crankbaits, but jerk baits just tend to be the most productive thing out there. And I think that's simply because you can pause a jerk bait. You can fish it even slower than you can fish a crankbait. So fishing the main break, typically what I'm going to reach for is a jerk bait. Now, there's a lot of different great jerk baits that are out on the market. You don't have to use what I recommend. What I recommend that you use instead is whatever you are used to using. If your favorite jerkbait is a husky jerk and you have a lot of confidence in it, that can be a great jerkbait. If your favorite jerkbait is a $25 mega bass and that's what you're used to using all the time, stick with that one. A lot of times with jerkbaits, I've found that what's much more important than finding the bait, the hot bait, it's finding a bait that you can work properly, that you just understand, because there's like a certain sleight of hand to working a jerkbait just right. It comes in the cast, making sure it comes down without tangling. It also comes in just the way that you feel it and the way that you're able to manipulate that bait and make it work just right. That's much more important than going out and buying a bunch of new jerkbaits trying to find one that works right, is finding one that you're comfortable with using. Now, there's a few that I like to use. I'm not too particular on any type of brand, but what I will say is there's 2 different directions I go. Usually I'm using a jerkbait in that 100 or 110 size, but I'll have one tied up that's going to be a shallow runner and one tied up that's going to be a deep runner. And not because the deep runners run really deep. The deep runners get a little bit deeper, but not a lot deeper. What I've noticed is I like fishing the shallow runners better. I just like the action of them better. They seem to be a little more appealing to fish. But at times when I'm fishing certain pieces of structure, I can't get down quick enough. If I'm fishing that 7, 8, 9 foot of water range, I just can't get down quick enough when I want to cast towards a particular boulder or a particular spot on the break. I want to get down there quicker and get to those fish and have it hold right on their nose right away. A deep running jerkbait allows me to get down to them a lot quicker. So that's kind of how I break it down between the 2 jerkbaits. A lot of times I'll use the same thing, the same size, but one will be a deep runner, one will be a shallow runner. When it comes to colors, I'm not too picky when it comes to colors, but there are 2 different hues that I tend to gravitate to much more than any others. One is going to be something white. White just works day in, day out through a variety of different conditions. I really like baits that have some sort of base in a white or a pearl white and then have like a blue hue on top. That blue hue, it just mimics a lot of what you see in the water. There's a lot of perch that may have a little blue hue to their belly, or definitely shiners like spot tail shiners. They definitely will have a lot of blue iridescence to them. But that's just something that I have a lot of confidence in and I've been using for years and works well for me. The second one is something that's chrome. There's something about a chrome bait on a sunny, windy day that just reflects a lot of light and grabs a lot of attention And I don't know what it is about it, but you get a sunny, windy day and the fish just are kind of aggressive, and that chrome is something that I've been using for years. Chrome, blue, silver, orange belly, the old Husky jerks. That's what I started with. And it's just something that I've stuck with. So it's something that's a white pattern and something that's a chrome pattern. Those are the two directions I go. When it's sunny out, I'm almost always going to grab the chrome. When fishing the jerkbaits, I try to keep it pretty simple. On Mille Lacs, where I do a lot of fishing throughout the spring and summer with smallmouth, sometimes I found that you really need to pause that bait for a long time to get the fish to commit. You may do 5, 10, 15-second pauses. Some people even do longer than that. On Big Stone, my experience is the fish will lose interest if you pause that long. With the new sonar that's out now, jerkbait fishing has become a lot easier. Instead of it all being confidence and intuition and instinct like it used to be, sometimes you can just watch them follow your jerkbait so you can change your cadence to how the fish reacts. What I've noticed is what works best for me is just a steady cadence, a twitch, twitch, pause, twitch, twitch, pause, and just don't change anything. Just do the twitch, twitch, pause, and just keep it going, chugging along. Early on in the spring, a tap, tap, pause, just slight little taps. That's typically what works best. You're not trying to move it very fast. You're just trying to keep the cadence going. As you get later and a little bit warmer, you may be able to get a little bit more aggressive. Jerk, jerk, pause instead of tap, tap, pause. But that's typically what I go with on Big Stone. When it gets much warmer than that, a lot of times I start opting for other baits instead. But the twitch, twitch, pause, that just gets the job done. Keep it steady, keep it consistent. This is where long casts are going to be very critical. When you find a piece of structure, use your side imaging. Go over these piles, these break lines. Find where the best rocks are. Really get that dialed in with your side imaging. Make some waypoints on there and then back way off it and make long bomb casts. You'll find that a lot of times these fish will follow it a ways, especially when the water's cold, or especially when you have a cold morning where they're a little bit rattled. You know, the day before it was warm and then a cold front came through. Sometimes they're going to follow that bait for a very long period of time. So you need a long cast so they can eventually commit to it. The second technique is really when I have a lot of my best days during the ice out period. And while there are certain times of the year, like the actual pre-spawn, which comes right after ice out, where it seems like you can get on more quantities of bigger fish, where you can really stack up some big mamas, it seems like ice out provides days where you can get on the fastest action of the year. Like literally there's days where you can go for a period of an afternoon and it's just every single cast. And what I have found is on these days, it's going to be a warming trend. So instead of a cold front or a morning where things have cooled down, you're going to find that it's the days where you started off in a jacket and you've peeled down to a sweatshirt or a t-shirt and the temperature just keeps climbing up. You're watching your sonar and you're seeing your water temp go up. The sun pops out of the clouds and really begins to warm things up down there. Fish have dark backs and light bellies. They can absorb a lot of sunlight. Fish, they've been tested, measured before. They've taken temperature readings on them. A fish that's in the shallows on a sunny day, their body temp, because of their dark back, can be up to 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding water. So when things are like that, when the sun pops out and things are warming up, those fish are going to rush right up into the shallows. And they're not going to go far away from those same breaks that you were catching them on during the cooler days. They're going to be very close to that, but they're just going to be up in the shallow structures, that 3 to 6 feet of water. I typically find them best and thickest in about 3 to 4 feet of water. It kind of depends what bay you're in. Generally, they're still going to be around rock, but they're not necessarily going to be on the rock pile. What you're going to find is they're going to be in the warmest water that is an area that has rock around it oftentimes. When I'm up here during these warming trend conditions and the fish have moved up shallow, my best technique is just throwing a shallow running flat-sided crankbait. There's a couple different ones on the market. Shallow running shad wrap works great, but my favorite is just a shallow running flicker shad. Number 7, cast it out, reel it in very slow so it barely ticks bottom. A lot of times you'll find that it goes like almost every single cast when you find the school. And the schools are not going to be 3, 6, 10 bass. It's going to be like 100 of them up there. It's going to be a lot of fish. So you can find that school and you can park on it for the rest of the afternoon. They'll be up there until things start to cool off again. Now, there's a couple different colors I'll use on these shallow running crankbaits. Most oftentimes, my favorite is just going to be the chrome blue silver with the orange belly. A lot of times the sun is going to be shining. That's why the fish have moved up shallow. Occasionally, what I've found is if the water's a little bit dirtier, I might go with something kind of like a brighter bluegill pattern, maybe something chartreuse, like a fire tiger, or something orange, like kind of one of those orange craw colors. But typically my best days, it's going to be chrome blue silver, orange belly. They'll wear the paint right off of that bait. Now, be it the crankbaits or the jerk baits, either one of them will work, whether you're on the main break or you're on the shallow structures. I've had fantastic days with jerk baits up in the shallow structures where I typically would throw a crankbait. I've done excellent on those. I've thrown a lot of crankbaits on the main break when I'm trying to cover more water a little quickly. Sometimes a crankbait is nice because you can cover water fast with a crankbait, and a lot of times a dummy will give up the school. So I will use a deeper running crankbait, you know, like a regular number 7 Shad Rap when I'm doing that. You can use fatter body bass crankbaits. DTs will also work. You can use square bills up in the shallows. But I've just found that when you're at the ice out period, when water temp is in the 40s, generally speaking, you're much better off with those flat-sided crankbaits. That flicker shad, the Shad Rap, be it shallow or deep running, that's the way to go. So that's the rundown. That's everything you really need to know. What I will say about Big Stone Lake is persistence really pays off on this body of water. A lot of people have been jaded by Big Stone over the years, or they've come out and had a great day and come back a couple times and had terrible luck. And what I'll say to Big Stone, especially in the spring of the year when the water's really cold, is perseverance really pays off. Mornings can be more difficult than afternoons. Sometimes it takes some water temperature change to get things going. Sometimes it's just that there's a lot of bass in a very small area, and it's easy to possibly pass fish by if you're not being very diligent in the way you're looking around for fish. Side imaging, forward-facing sonar, they can be very beneficial up into the shallows to finding fish off to the sides of the boat, because a lot of times it's going to be a very large school in a very small area. I'll give you a quick recap on everything. Number 1, look at the wind and weather. See what the trend is doing. Warmer trends are going to push fish shallow. Cooler trends, cold fronts, they're going to have fish sticking closer to the shelf, closer to that main break. Second thing is looking for the right ramp. Big Stone is a windy lake, so that Mallard Point on a north wind, the Ortonville ramp on a south wind, everything in between those ramps is going to be bass territory. Once you get to the north half of the lake, there isn't nearly as much up there. So if you're new to the lake, stick to the south half of the lake. Number 3 is going to be the layout of the lake. Most of the fish that I'm going to find are either going to be related to the main break during the cold fronts, or they're going to be in the shallow structures at 3 to 6 feet of water during warming trends. I don't fish the basin very much. It's very hard to pin anything down out there. It's just too vast. There's nothing to really hold them in one spot. And the bank just doesn't seem to hold fish with any sort of numbers or consistency when water temps are in the 40s. So stick to that main break, stick to the shallow structures. Number 3, jerk baits. Just go consistent with them. Slow, consistent. Pick out a bait that you like. Whites are great. Chromes are great. The shallow crankbaits, the shallow number 7 Shad Raps and flicker shads, use those on a warming trend. Go up shallow. Look at your electronics and try to find those large schools of fish in the warmest pockets of water available. Oftentimes they'll be in protected bays. And generally it's going to be around rock. Hey, I hope these tips help you out. I'll have another video coming out in the next day or so that's going to cover the pre-spawn period. If you want to catch big bass and you want to go out to Big Stone Lake, pre-spawn is the time to be here. That is when the biggest fish of the season are caught. That's when the biggest numbers of big fish are caught. So pre-spawn is the best time to be on Big Stone Lake. Ice out is a fantastic time, but pre-spawn even takes the cake. It gets even better. Hey, I hope these tips help you out, and good luck fishing.